The first signs of the Krogoth invasion were subtle: disturbances in the galactic deep space sensors, unexplained flickers of static, and sudden losses of communication from distant colonies. No one thought it would be more than a rogue asteroid or a fluke anomaly. But when the first Krogoth warship appeared in the skies over Gornath, a mining planet on the edge of the Coalition, all doubts evaporated. The Krogoth didn't announce themselves with grand speeches or demands. They didn't need to. Their invasion was swift, brutal, and utterly efficient. Within hours, Gornath's sky was filled with their ships, enormous, organic-looking behemoths that seemed to merge with the very stars themselves. Thousands of insectoid warriors poured down from the ships, their spindly limbs scuttling over the landscape, while massive biomechanical machines laid waste to entire cities. The defensive systems, designed to ward off the occasional pirate or space debris, were useless against this new kind of enemy. It was an invasion on a scale no one had ever dreamed possible. Within a single day, the planet's communications fell silent. The Krogoth didn't just conquer, they erased. They absorbed. The survivors of Gornath would soon learn that the Krogoth saw no need for prisoners. Those who resisted were exterminated. Those who surrendered were converted. Those who tried to escape found no sanctuary. The Krogoth controlled everything: the air, the ground, the very thoughts of the population. Their psychic influence stretched across the stars, turning the greatest minds in the Coalition into trembling husks of what they once were. Panic spread across the galaxy as the Krogoth systematically wiped out entire systems, rendering the once proud UGC forces helpless. But for all their technological prowess, the Krogoth underestimated one thing. Something that even their vast intelligence couldn't predict: humanity's spirit. Humanity had always been the underdog of the galaxy. When the UGC was formed, humans had been little more than an afterthought, just one more species tossed into the melting pot of sentient beings. Earth's history was marred by wars, divisions, and survival on a hostile planet. But it was in the face of overwhelming odds that humans had always thrived. The more they were pushed down, the harder they fought back. The more their backs were against the wall, the more they adapted, reinvented, and overcame. And the Krogoth had miscalculated the most dangerous part of humanity: its sheer unwillingness to surrender. The first signs of human resistance came not in a grand military effort, but in the most unexpected place: a civilian uprising on the edge of the UGC. Word of the Krogoth's brutality spread like wildfire, even faster than the invaders could control. On a small moon in the Arden sector, a group of miners who had seen their families slaughtered and their homes turned to rubble had fought back with nothing but makeshift weapons. They weren't soldiers, just survivors, but they fought and they died fighting. The Krogoth didn't know what to make of it. In their eyes, these beings were nothing more than insects, too weak to resist the might of their empire. But the miners' resistance sparked something inside humanity, something the invaders didn't understand. Back on Earth, as the news reached the planet, it galvanized the world that had been teetering on the brink of panic. Governments scrambled, but humanity didn't wait for permission. Every human knew that they stood alone in the galaxy, abandoned by the UGC and facing the terror of an alien race that could erase them without a second thought. Earth had no allies, no advanced fleets, no vast armies at its disposal. But humanity had something else: determination. A deep, unshakable fire burned in their hearts. Althea Crane, commander of the Earth Defense Forces, knew that the first step towards survival wasn't in overwhelming force. It was in preserving what remained of humanity's will to fight. She gathered the remnants of Earth's armed forces, recruiting survivors from every corner of the planet. Every soldier, scientist, engineer, and even civilians became part of the resistance effort. Crane's message was simple but powerful. We are not dead. We will fight. The human resistance wasn't built on hope. It was built on sheer, stubborn defiance. The Krogoth, so sure of their victory, began to take notice. Their warlords and high commanders saw these insignificant humans as nothing more than a nuisance, a distraction. They dispatched smaller scout fleets to subdue the resistance, eager to crush the last embers of defiance before they could grow. They thought they had already won, but they hadn't met Rylan McAllister. Rylan wasn't a general or a leader of nations. He was just a soldier, a human soldier, and unlike any of the other species in the galaxy, Rylan fought like a force of nature, driven not by strategy, but by rage and survival. His reputation had spread quickly in the underground resistance. Some said he had a gift, others that he was simply a man consumed by his need for vengeance. But none could deny the power he wielded, a power that seemed to bend the very elements to his will. As the first Krogoth fleet entered Earth's atmosphere, ready to unleash their wrath, they would find something they didn't expect, a human soldier who refused to fall. And thus, the real war began. This continuation builds the context and escalation of the Krogoth invasion, while introducing the resilience and resolve of humanity. The mysterious figure of Rylan McAllister is teased, setting the stage for his heroic rise. The first human victory against the Krogoth came on the harsh, barren world of Varnis Prime. It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. A world wasn't liberated, and there were no grand celebrations. But it was something far more important. It was a proof of concept. The humans could fight back. Against all odds, the resistance managed to cripple a Krogoth supply ship in a daring raid, stealing crucial technology and intelligence about the invaders' operations. The victory was small, but it was a spark that ignited a flame across the galaxy. The message was clear. Humanity could still resist. Althea Crane saw the implications of the Varnis Prime operation immediately. As she watched the after-action report in her command center on Earth, she knew that the first major task for humanity was to rebuild its strength, not just militarily, but emotionally. In the heart of the resistance, hope was fragile, easily smothered by the Krogoth's unrelenting attacks. But Crane knew that if humans could rally together and keep fighting, no matter how small the victories, they could eventually force the invaders into a retreat. "Hope is our weapon," Crane said to the gathered resistance leaders, her voice steady despite the weight of their losses. "It's time we make the galaxy remember what it means to be human." As the message spread across the Earth and the surrounding colonies, new recruits flocked to join the resistance. Men and women of every race, from the jungles of Africa to the icy plains of Antarctica, volunteered to fight against the Krogoth. Many were civilians, former teachers, farmers, engineers, ordinary people who had been thrust into an extraordinary war. They weren't soldiers by training, but they were united by one thing: the will to survive. No matter how badly they had been beaten, no matter how hopeless it seemed, they refused to lie down. Despite the human resistance's newfound determination, the Krogoth remained a constant, crushing force. The alien invaders had no interest in diplomacy or subtlety. They simply took what they wanted, and their weapons were beyond anything humanity had ever encountered. Their insectoid soldiers could survive harsh environments that would suffocate or burn most species alive. Their biomechanical war machines ripped through cities like a blade through flesh. Most notably, their psychic abilities allowed them to manipulate the minds of weaker species, reducing them to puppets. Crane understood the psychological war the Krogoth waged. It wasn't just about battlefield victories. It was about eroding the will to resist, breaking people from the inside. That's why she knew the human flame, the essence of resistance, had to be kept alive at all costs. A new strategy began to take shape under Crane's leadership. It wasn't about fighting the Krogoth on their terms. It was about exploiting humanity's greatest strengths: adaptability, unpredictability, and a burning desire to protect what was theirs. Earth might not have the most powerful weapons, but the humans had something the Krogoth couldn't comprehend: an undying determination to survive and to push through against all odds. In a small, hidden underground facility, Crane met with a select group of commanders and strategists to plan the next phase of their resistance. They knew they couldn't take on the Krogoth directly, not yet. Their resources were too limited, and the invaders were too powerful. But humanity could strike where the Krogoth least expected it: in their supply lines, their rear bases, and even in the smallest, most unassuming places. Guerrilla warfare was their only chance for survival, but they needed something, or someone, special to lead it. Crane turned to her intelligence officers, who had been monitoring the most unlikely of figures. Rylan McAllister, the flame fighter. His reputation had spread throughout the resistance like wildfire. The man, once just another soldier, was now something more. He had become a symbol. There were whispers that Rylan's ability to control fire was more than just skill. It was as if the very fire of humanity itself burned within him. His strikes against Krogoth forces were legendary, impossible victories against impossible odds. "He's our best chance," Crane said as she turned to the team. "We need him on our side. If anyone can lead this war, it's him." But there was more to the story of Rylan McAllister than anyone knew. His involvement in the human resistance went beyond his fiery abilities. There was a fire inside him, something deeper, something personal. His rage, his grief, and his need for justice all converged in a single, focused purpose: to stop the Krogoth at all costs. Rylan had lost everything when the Krogoth invaded Earth. His family, his home, his life, all consumed in an instant by the alien invaders. The flames he now wielded weren't just a tool of war. They were the physical manifestation of his pain, his sorrow, and his need for vengeance. The fire didn't just burn, it consumed. When he fought, it was as though the very spirit of humanity's defiance lived within him, and nothing, no alien, no weapon, no fear, could extinguish it. Rylan had no interest in the grand strategy of generals or politicians. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He didn't care for medals or recognition. All he wanted was to fight, to burn. Crane knew the risks. Rylan was a loose cannon, a wild card. He couldn't be controlled or contained. But in these dark times, maybe that was exactly what humanity needed. As the meeting adjourned, and Crane prepared to send her most trusted officers to locate Rylan and bring him into the fold, one thing was clear: humanity had found its spark. The Krogoth may have raised the galaxy, But there was something they hadn't accounted for, something they couldn't understand: the human will. And no matter how many planets they destroyed, no matter how many lives they extinguished, humanity would never stop fighting. This continuation builds on humanity's resolve, while introducing the critical element of Ryland McAllister's backstory. It focuses on the emergence of the Resistance and sets the stage for the pivotal role he will play in the upcoming battles. The search for Ryland McAllister was not an easy task. After the devastation of Earth's initial encounters with the Krogoth, the planet was in chaos. Cities lay in ruin, the skies were filled with the remnants of fallen fleets, and the survivors, those who hadn't already fled to the outer colonies, were scattered. The resistance movement had grown, but it was still a disorganized effort, struggling to form a unified front against an enemy that had already crushed more advanced species across the galaxy. Crane's officers scoured the remnants of Earth's cities and remote outposts. After weeks of searching, they finally found him in the heart of the Nevada desert, alone, surrounded by a ring of smoldering alien carcasses. Ryland was no longer just a soldier. He had become something else, something more primal. His once crisp uniform had been torn and singed, his face smeared with soot, but there was no mistaking the fire that burned in his eyes. When they approached him, he didn't speak at first. Instead, he silently turned toward them, the air around him rippling with heat, as though the world itself was bowing to his fury. His hands were still glowing faintly with the residue of the plasma energy he could summon at will. To the resistance team, Ryland McAllister wasn't a man. They couldn't quite place him. He was an elemental force, something beyond human, a weapon forged by necessity and sharpened by loss. Groll Crane wants you to lead, one of Crane's officers said carefully, his voice betraying the awe and wariness that Ryland invoked. Ryland didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, watching the officer, his body a conduit of barely contained power. The air around him grew warmer as he took a step forward, his boots crunching against the scorched earth. Finally, he spoke in a low, gravelly voice, heavy with both wariness and resolve. "I don't follow orders," Ryland said flatly, his eyes narrowing. "Not unless it's worth fighting for." The officer hesitated, but something about Ryland's demeanor left no room for negotiation. The general's message had been clear. Humanity had no time for hesitation. They needed someone to fight like the world depended on it, and Ryland was the only one who understood that. "We're not asking you to follow orders," the officer pressed. "We're asking you to lead the fight. You are the flame, the symbol they need. But we need you, now." For a long moment, there was only the sound of wind sweeping across the desert. Then, without warning, Ryland's fist clenched. A pulse of heat shot from his body, sending a shockwave that caused the nearby rocks to crack and shatter. The fire was not just an element. It was his response to the invaders. His control over it was more than just physical. It was personal. He had nothing left to lose. "I'll fight," he said, his voice quieter, but laced with raw determination. "But if we're going to win, we do it my way." With that, Ryland became the spark that set humanity's resistance ablaze. Under his leadership, small teams of fighters were organized for quick, brutal strikes against the Krogoth's supply lines, their communications hubs, and their bioengineering centers. His reputation spread across the surviving pockets of human resistance, and wherever his name was whispered, a fire was lit in the hearts of the downtrodden. Ryland's tactics were unorthodox. driven by his understanding of the Krogoth's weaknesses, not just their physical vulnerabilities, but their arrogance. Krogoth were creatures of order, driven by their belief in superiority and psychic control. Rylan exploited their predictability, always staying one step ahead by attacking when and where they least expected. He often used guerrilla warfare, hitting Krogoth forces with precision and disappearing into the shadows before they could retaliate. What made Rylan truly dangerous was his ability to manipulate his plasma abilities in ways no one had anticipated. He didn't just burn his enemies, he disoriented them. With each wave of heat, he distorted the Krogoth's technology, causing their weapons to overheat, their biocrafting machinery to malfunction, and their communication systems to scramble. His flames weren't just destruction. They were a way to disrupt the very essence of the Krogoth's battle tactics. As the weeks passed, the human resistance grew bolder. The first major victory came when Rylan led a raid against a Krogoth mothership that had been stationed over a captured colony. The mission was simple: board the ship, sabotage its power core, and escape before the Krogoth could retaliate. But Rylan had other plans. As his team infiltrated the ship, he triggered a firestorm within its engines, igniting the fuel reserves. The explosion that followed was nothing short of catastrophic, crippling the Krogoth's presence in that sector for weeks. His success became the rallying cry for other human resistance factions, and Rylan's name was spoken with awe and fear. To the Krogoth, he was an enigma, a human who fought not with their weapons, but with something more primal, something they could not fathom. The Flame Fighter was not just a soldier, he was an embodiment of humanity's refusal to die. Rylan's battles weren't just against the Krogoth. They were against his own demons. As each victory piled up, the weight of his losses pressed harder upon him. His desire for vengeance, the desire to make the Krogoth pay for what they had taken from him, grew stronger with every battle. The fire inside him burned hotter, and with it his need to destroy, to consume everything that had taken his family, his home, and his life. But even as he fought, even as the fire raged inside him, there was a flicker of something else, something human. The deeper the war waged, the more he realized that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in the flame itself, but in the ability to stand together. And if he was going to win this fight, if they were going to survive, he couldn't carry the weight of the war alone. This continuation of Part 3 introduces Rylan's leadership and his unconventional, fire-driven tactics in the resistance against the Krogoth. It explores his growth as a figure of hope and defiance, while hinting at the personal struggles he faces as the fire within him grows both as a weapon and as a symbol. The momentum of humanity's resistance was undeniable, and for the first time since the Krogoth invasion, the invaders began to feel the weight of the fight. The strikes led by Rylan McAllister had become so frequent and devastating that the Krogoth began to alter their strategy. What was once a calculated and swift destruction of entire worlds now gave way to more cautious and deliberate movements. They had underestimated humanity's resilience, and now they faced the consequences. But it was not just Rylan who was shifting the tides of war. The resistance as a whole was evolving. Once a scattered collection of rebel cells, human resistance efforts began to coalesce into something greater. General Crane, with her strategic brilliance, spearheaded efforts to organize the scattered forces. The remnants of Earth's armed forces, now bolstered by skilled scientists, engineers, and tacticians from the far-flung colonies, started to form a semblance of a real army. Every planet they reclaimed, every strategic strike they made, brought them one step closer to organizing a proper defense. Crane's command center, built deep underground in the ruins of Earth's once proud capital, was now the heart of the resistance. Maps of occupied worlds, Krogoth ship movements, and key military targets lined the walls. The first tentative steps toward unity had been made, but Crane knew there was still much to be done. The resistance could not simply rely on guerrilla tactics forever. They needed to match the Krogoth in firepower and strategy. And that meant more than just brute strength. It meant using everything they had to outthink their enemy. Every move had to be calculated, every strategy precise, and no resource wasted. One of Crane's most crucial breakthroughs was the discovery of Krogoth weaknesses, flaws in their advanced biomechanical constructs, especially their reliance on psychic domination. Though their psychic abilities were formidable, they weren't without limits. Crane knew that if they could sever the Krogoth's ability to coordinate their forces mentally, the human forces might have a fighting chance. But that was a long way off. Rylan had no interest in the politics of strategy, or the meticulous planning that Crane and her generals were engrossed in. To him, the war was simple: burn the invaders down, one strike at a time. Team had grown since the raid on the Krogoth mothership. More soldiers had joined his ranks, drawn to his intensity and fearlessness. They weren't the best-trained military personnel, but under Ryland's leadership, they were becoming something more, an unrelenting force that knew no fear. Early days of the resistance, Ryland had fought solo, relying on his own strength and instincts. But as the war dragged on, he began to realize that his power alone couldn't turn the tide. He had to forge alliances within the resistance, learn to trust others. It wasn't easy. Ryland was driven by a deep personal rage, and at times he found it difficult to temper that drive in the face of collective leadership. But slowly, reluctantly, he came to understand that there was power in numbers, human numbers. One of the closest bonds Ryland formed was with Captain Lucia Voss, a brilliant tactician and former UGC officer. She had seen the devastation wrought by the Krogoth firsthand and was determined to find a way to defeat them on a more global scale. Together, they crafted strikes that balanced both Ryland's instinctual, destructive approach and Lucia's more calculated precision. They complemented each other, becoming the beating heart of the Resistance's resurgence. The first major joint operation between Ryland's guerrilla fighters and the organized human forces took place on the icy world of Farron 5. The Krogoth had established a major outpost there, using it as a staging ground for further invasions of the inner colonies. The planet was strategically crucial, and Crane knew that taking it back would send a strong message to the invaders. It wasn't just about reclaiming a world. It was about proving that humanity could reclaim its destiny. The operation was ambitious, far larger than anything the Resistance had attempted before. Ryland's team would be the spearhead, infiltrating the outer defenses, drawing the Krogoth forces into a trap, while Lucia's ground forces would provide backup at the critical moment. The entire operation hinged on timing. Ryland and his fighters had to strike with enough force to draw the attention of the Krogoth warlords, forcing them into a vulnerable position. As the battle commenced, Ryland and his team stormed the outer layers of the Krogoth fortifications with a ferocity that only he could summon. His plasma bursts lit up the sky, cutting through the alien constructs, like a hot knife through butter. The Krogoth had become accustomed to devastating attacks, but Ryland's assault was different. He was unpredictable. His flames scorched the ground, disorienting the alien forces, while Lucia's team closed in, securing key positions on the ground. It wasn't long before the Krogoth realized they had underestimated the humans once more, but by then it was too late. The trap had been set. As the human forces closed in, the Krogoth warlords panicked, their psychic coordination faltering as they struggled to adapt to a battle they couldn't control. Ryland led the charge directly into the heart of the enemy stronghold, his flames dancing across the battlefield, a symbol of humanity's unyielding will. His plasma-wrought fury tore through the Krogoth command center, disabling their ability to communicate and control their forces. With the Krogoth in disarray, the human forces stormed to the final defenses, and Farron 5 was reclaimed. The victory was hard-earned, with losses on both sides, but it was a crucial win for the Resistance. Sent a message to the Krogoth that humanity was not ready to give up, not yet, and not ever. The aftermath, Ryland stood before the horizon, his chest rising and falling with every breath. The fire inside him still burned, but now it was joined by something else, a deep, quiet determination. The Resistance was no longer just about revenge. It was about survival, and more than that, it was about something he hadn't expected, hope. The fire, it seemed, could light the way forward. This continuation of Part 4 explores a major shift in the Resistance's strategy, with Ryland's role evolving from a lone wolf to a leader of a collective force. The victory on Farron 5 shows the growing strength and coordination of humanity's resistance, while also highlighting Ryland's personal transformation from vengeance to a more unified purpose. The victory on Farron 5 was a turning point, but it was not the end of the war. Despite the strategic blow to the Krogoth, the invasion continued. The galaxy was vast, and the invaders were relentless. Their reach long, their ships vast. They had not yet abandoned their mission to crush humanity, and the losses the Resistance had sustained made it clear they were still fighting an uphill battle. The days following the battle were filled with recovery and regrouping. Admiral Crane wasted no time in consolidating the victory, ensuring that the liberated world would become a vital stronghold for the Resistance. While Ryland's success had lit a fire under humanity, Crane knew they couldn't afford to bask in a single triumph. More would be needed. The Krogoth were not the kind to retreat. They would learn, adapt, and come back even more dangerous. Ryland, for his part, was not one to sit idle. The victory had reignited his fire, but it also reminded him of what was still at stake. Standing on the command deck of a newly formed human warship, overlooking the stars, Ryland felt the weight of the war pressing down on him like never before. He had tasted victory, but the cost of that victory was already taking its toll. The people of Farron 5 were free, but how many more worlds would fall before humanity could truly push the invaders back? He wasn't alone in his contemplation. Captain Lucia Voss stood beside him, watching the same starry expanse. Her sharp eyes, ever calculating, were filled with the same determination, but her silence spoke volumes. She knew that their next steps would be crucial. "We can't rest on our laurels," she said softly, almost to herself. Ryland nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I know." Crane had tasked Lucia with devising a plan to hit a critical Krogoth installation on Arctis III, a gas giant that had been turned into a fortress of sorts, housing a massive fleet and acting as a staging ground for an invasion of the core colonies. It was a high-risk operation, but it was also a chance to deal a blow to the Krogoth on a scale that could potentially cripple their plans. The key to the mission's success would be not just overwhelming firepower, but precision. Rylan, of course, didn't care about precision. To him, this was an opportunity to unleash his fury on the invaders, to burn them out of existence. But Lucia's mind worked differently. She saw the intricacies of the plan, the timing, the tactical strikes that would allow them to get in and out without too many casualties. Ryland's fire was the tool, but Lucia's strategy was the blueprint that would give it shape. As the planning continued, Ryland began to feel the weight of leadership more than ever. The resistance fighters who followed him were not just soldiers. They were people who had lost everything, just as he had. Many had become just like him, fueled by rage and a thirst for revenge. But Ryland realized that this wasn't sustainable. There was no victory in pure destruction, and no future in an endless cycle of vengeance. Despite his fierce nature, he had always known that it wasn't just about burning the Krogoth away. There was something else driving him, a flicker of hope, not just for himself, but for humanity as a whole. He had been so focused on the fire of his own anger, he had almost lost sight of it. As the mission to Arctis III loomed closer, Ryland found himself haunted by doubts that he couldn't shake. Would his fury be enough to win this war? Could he continue to be the symbol the resistance needed, or would he burn out, consumed by the very fire that had made him a hero? The answer came when the operation began. The moment they arrived in orbit around Arctis III, the situation became clear. The Krogoth had anticipated a human strike and fortified their position, turning the gas giant's moons into a heavily guarded perimeter. Any attempt to engage directly would result in devastating losses. Lucia's plan, however, called for a much bolder move. Using the gas giant's powerful gravity wells to mask their approach, Rylan and a small team of elite fighters would infiltrate the moons surrounding the planet and disrupt the Krogoth fleet's ability to coordinate. In parallel, human warships would create a diversion on the opposite side of the system, drawing attention away from the main assault. Ryland's team dropped into the atmosphere of one of the moons, and as the ship's engines cut off, plunging them into silence, Ryland felt the familiar burn of anticipation deep inside him. He had always been at his best when the odds were overwhelming, when the fire was all that stood between him and annihilation. When the time came, Ryland unleashed his fury. With a roar, he tore through the Krogoth defense positions, his plasma flames setting the very air alight. Each strike he made was not just an attack, it was a message. The resistance had come to stay, and it wasn't backing down. His team followed closely, executing their part of the mission with precision, just as Lucia had planned. But something had shifted in Ryland. The rage was still there, burning brightly, but now it was tempered with something else, clarity. As he fought, he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. This was a fight for everyone, for every world still under the Krogoth boot. By the time the Krogoth forces realized they had been outmaneuvered, it was too late. Their command structures began to fracture, their ships drifting aimlessly as the human forces closed in. The mission was a success, the Krogoth fleet shattered, and Arctis III's defenses crippled. As Ryland watched the chaos unfold from the cockpit of his ship, a rare feeling washed over him. satisfaction, but not from revenge. From the knowledge that humanity had just taken another step toward winning this war, not because of one man's fire, but because of the collective will of a species who refused to bow down. In Part 5, we see Ryland's growth as a leader, his shift from vengeance-driven fury to a more unified approach, and the realization that the resistance is not just about fighting, it's about enduring. The mission on Arctis 3 solidifies humanity's strength as they begin to challenge the Krogoth in a more strategic and coordinated manner. The victory on Arctis 3 was a remarkable one, but as Ryland McAllister stood in the command center of the Resistance flagship, staring at the fresh reports from the battlefield, he couldn't shake the growing sense of unease gnawing at him. With victory, every strike against the Krogoth came at a cost. Yes, they had crippled the fleet surrounding Arctis 3, but the alien invaders would only regroup, learn, and adapt. Ryland had seen it before. The Krogoth didn't break, they only bent, and when they returned, they came back stronger. The more Ryland fought, the more the gnawing feeling deepened. He had become the face of the resistance, the flame that lit humanity's hope. But his own hope was starting to flicker. The burning desire to avenge his home, to burn the Krogoth to the ground, was beginning to feel less like a cause and more like a curse. Lucia Voss, ever perceptive, noticed the change in him. She had known Ryland long enough to see beyond the fiery exterior. There was a quiet moment after their debriefing on the mission when she approached him, her face unreadable. "You're thinking about the cost," Lucia said simply, sitting across from him at the war table. Ryland didn't respond at first. His eyes lingered on the holographic projections of the Krogoth forces scattered across the galaxy. It felt as if the resistance was fighting a war of attrition, each victory pushing the enemy further, only for them to regroup and return in greater numbers. "I'm thinking about the cost of all of this," Ryland muttered finally. "Every battle, every victory. We keep pushing them back, but we're losing more and more people. What's the point of winning if we're just burning ourselves out along the way?" His gaze softened. "You're not alone in this, Ryland. The rest of us, me, Crane, everyone, are fighting too. But you can't carry this weight by yourself." He clenched his fists, staring out into the depths of space. The fire within him still roared, but it was no longer a blaze of unyielding rage. It was a burning, empty void. Was there a way forward that didn't end with humanity consumed by its own need for revenge? "We've got a big problem," Lucia continued, sensing his struggle. "The Krogoth aren't just a military force. They're also deeply entrenched in human minds. They're toying with us, pushing us to the brink. We've already seen what they can do with their psychic capabilities." Ryland turned to her, eyes narrowing. "You think they're trying to get inside our heads?" "I know they are." Lucia's voice dropped low. "They've done it before. With colonies with other species. They break you down mentally before they destroy you physically. It's not just the firepower we need to worry about. The Krogoth are trying to fracture us from the inside." A chilling silence settled between them. Ryland knew what Lucia was talking about. The Krogoth didn't just attack with weapons. They attacked with fear, with psychological warfare that could break even the strongest minds. He had seen it in the survivors, in the haunted expressions of soldiers who had fought in the battles before. No amount of physical strength could shield the mind from the kind of damage the Krogoth inflicted. But Ryland couldn't afford to lose focus, not when the war was so close to tipping. He couldn't allow himself to get bogged down in doubts and mental traps. He had to keep pushing. Yet, as much as he wanted to believe it, part of him felt something else. A creeping suspicion that he was not just fighting an external enemy, but something much darker inside himself. The conversation was interrupted by the sudden arrival of General Crane. Her face was grim, and there was a palpable tension in her posture. "We have a problem," she said, pacing up to the table. "The Krogoth are preparing a counter-offensive. They've gathered what's left of their fleets around Vectros, the mining colony in the Ort belt. It's an ideal position to launch a full-scale invasion into the core colonies." Ryland's eyes sharpened, but his mind was elsewhere. His thoughts still lingered on what Lucia had said. Could the Krogoth be manipulating him, pushing him into a mental corner? He had always prided himself on his resilience, but now doubts crept in. How much longer could he continue this relentless fight? How much longer could the resistance last? "I'll take the team in," Ryland said firmly, snapping his thoughts back to the present. "We'll hit them before they can launch the invasion." Crane's expression softened for a moment. "Ryland, I need you to hear me on this. We can't keep going like this. We're stretching our resources thin. We need a strategic victory, not just a small one, something that will force the Krogoth to rethink their entire invasion strategy." "Then I'll lead the charge," Ryland said without hesitation. "We can't wait any longer." There was a brief moment of uncertainty in Crane's eyes, but she quickly masked it. "All right, but we'll need everything we've got for this one. I want your team in full battle-ready condition. No mistakes." Ryland nodded, but even as he prepared for the assault, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The battle ahead would be their greatest challenge yet, but in the pit of his stomach he felt a gnawing fear. They weren't just fighting the Krogoth. They were fighting themselves, their own resilience, their own limits. That night, as Ryland lay in his quarters, staring up at the ceiling of his small cabin aboard the warship, he realized the truth. The Krogoth were masters of war, but they had one weakness. Their enemies didn't just fight them physically, they had to outlast them mentally. The battle ahead wouldn't just be fought with plasma and flame. It would be fought with resolve, with the strength to endure when everything felt like it was falling apart. As Ryland and his team infiltrated the surface, the battle began. Plasma fire lit up the sky as human forces engaged with the Krogoth, their weapons wreaking havoc on the invaders' defenses. The alien forces retaliated with brutal efficiency, their psychic influence spreading across the battlefield like a shroud of darkness. Soldiers, even the most hardened veterans, began to stagger, their movements becoming sluggish, their minds faltering under the pressure. The Krogoth were attempting to break them, not with their weapons, but with their minds. Ryland could feel the pressure building, the subtle whispers invading his thoughts, pushing at the edges of his sanity. It was as if the very air around him was thick with their influence, the psychic presence pressing down on him like a crushing weight. He pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. His flames danced across the battlefield, his plasma bursts scorching anything that dared to stand in his way. He could feel Lucia's presence beside him, her tactical brilliance guiding their every move, her calm demeanor grounding him as they fought side by side. But even as they made progress, Ryland couldn't ignore the creeping sensation of something wrong, something darker that lingered just beneath the surface. The Krogoth were more than just invaders. They were a force that sought to twist the very fabric of human resolve. And as Rylan fought, a terrifying realization began to settle in. The war they were fighting was not just against the Krogoth. It was a battle for the soul of humanity itself. As the team pushed deeper into the heart of Vectros, Rylan knew this mission would change everything. Victory was no longer just about defeating the Krogoth. It was about reclaiming the very essence of what it meant to be human, and that fight, as it turned out, was much harder than any battle with plasma or fire. In Part 7, we witness Rylan and the Resistance's critical mission to Vectros, where they faced not only the physical might of the Krogoth, but also the insidious psychological warfare that threatens to unravel their resolve. The battle is not just a military engagement, but a fight for the heart of humanity itself. Rylan and his team fight not just with weapons, but with the strength of their minds and spirits. The darkness of Vectros weighed heavily on Rylan. It was a different kind of battlefield now. The fire of his anger still burned hot in his chest, but now every step he took through the wreckage felt like walking deeper into the heart of something more profound. The Krogoth had always been formidable enemies in terms of firepower, but they were attacking the very core of what it meant to be human. And that, Rylan realized, was something they might never recover from if they didn't strike decisively. As his team fought their way deeper into Vectros' shattered ruins, the Krogoth's psychic influence only grew stronger. It wasn't just the soldiers who faltered. Rylan could see it in their faces, the doubt creeping in. Soldiers who had once been as resolute as stone now wavered, unsure of their next move. They had never faced a foe that could reach so deeply into their minds. Atmosphere of the planet itself seemed to push against them, an oppressive weight that made every breath feel like an effort. The Krogoth weren't just trying to break them physically, they were dismantling the very foundation of their will. The walls of resistance were cracking, and in the midst of it all, Rylan found himself questioning something he'd never allowed himself to before. Was this war even winnable? Lucia, ever the tactician, was always 3 steps ahead, her mind working even when the battle raged around them. She sensed Rylan's inner turmoil. She knew the fire inside him was wavering, and that, more than anything else, was what made this mission so dangerous. If Rylan lost his will to fight, the entire resistance could crumble. "Stay focused, Rylan," Lucia's voice crackled over the comms, pulling him out of his spiral. "We've got work to do." Her words were enough to snap him back into action. They had already taken out several key Krogoth installations, but the main facility, the nerve center that controlled the Krogoth fleet, was still ahead, hidden deep beneath the surface in an underground bunker. If they could destroy it, they could cripple the Krogoth's ability to retaliate. It was their only hope to change the tide of the war. But the closer they got to their target, the more Rylan could feel it. The Krogoth weren't just manipulating the battlefield, they were manipulating him. Their psychic tendrils were burrowing deeper into his mind, testing his resolve. Every step forward felt like a fight against something much greater than just the alien invaders. It was a battle against his own fear, his own doubts. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and the air crackled with the energy of an incoming strike. A fleet of Krogoth ships descended from the sky, massive and black, blocking out the dim light of Vectros' shattered moons. A final assault. Rylan's team had reached the bunker, but the Krogoth were already waiting for them. The resistance forces were now locked in a desperate fight against overwhelming odds. Rylan's hand tightened around his plasma rifle, the heat of the weapon grounding him, but it wasn't enough. The Krogoth's psychic influence was everywhere now. was in the very air, in the cracks of his mind, and he could hear their whispers, doubts, fears, voices trying to pull him into a deeper, darker place. And then he saw it. A vision. The faces of his fallen comrades, twisted by the Krogoth's influence, surrounded him. They weren't real. He knew that, but in the moment they felt all too real. They whispered his name, urging him to stop, to let the war end, to surrender. They told him that humanity had already lost. They told him that no one could defeat the Krogoth. They told him the fire inside him would consume him if he kept going. Ryland's knees buckled, his mind reeling under the onslaught of visions, his own fears amplified by the Krogoth. His breath came in sharp gasps as he staggered backward, nearly falling to the ground. But then he remembered something. A fleeting thought, like a distant flame. It wasn't just the fire that had brought them this far. It was the strength of their will. The fire was powerful, but it was the human spirit that would see them through. The Krogoth might have tried to break him, to force him to question everything, but they didn't understand humanity. The more they pushed, the more they made him realize just how much he had left to fight for. Ryland drew in a deep breath, steadying himself. The fire inside him roared louder than before, but now it was different. It wasn't just rage, it was defiance. He stood tall, feeling the weight of the war, the weight of every life lost, every life still to be saved. He wasn't going to let the Krogoth control him. Not now, not ever. "Yeah, we're going in," he said, his voice calm, unwavering. "On your 6. Lucia's voice came through, sharp and clear. Ryland charged forward, his team following close behind. The psychic influence pressed harder, but Ryland ignored it. Every step was a fight, but it was a fight he could win. As they reached the heart of the Krogoth base, Ryland felt the flames inside him surge once more. This time, they weren't just fire. They were a promise. A promise to every person who had fought, to every life still at stake. With a final, defiant roar, Ryland activated his last weapon, the plasma charge that would destroy the Krogoth's command center. The explosion that followed was deafening, a wave of destruction that sent shockwaves through the entire base. Aftermath, as the dust settled and the battle raged on around him, Ryland stood victorious. The Krogoth had been defeated. The resistance had won, not just with fire, but with something far more powerful, the indomitable spirit of humanity. They had proven that no matter how dark the path, no matter how insurmountable the odds, they would never bow. In Part 8, Ryland's internal struggle reaches its peak as the Krogoth push him to the brink with their psychological warfare. But in the end, it is the strength of the human spirit, the resolve to endure even in the face of overwhelming odds, that enables Ryland and his team to overcome their darkest fears and destroy the Krogoth's command center. The final victory is not just a military one, but a reaffirmation of humanity's unbreakable will to fight and survive.